When the call came in just before dawn, officers expected a disturbance, a fight that had spilled into the street, a domestic argument turned ugly. What they found instead was a quiet tableau in the heart of downtown Seattle. A young woman seated on the stone steps of an office building, her coat pulled close, her phone dark in her hand. She was already gone. There was no sign of forced entry on the nearby doorway, no scattered purse, no obvious scuffle. The scene felt ordinary and therefore more unsettling. A life interrupted in a place where people pass by without seeing the small dramas of one another. Her name was Leah Morales, 26, an events coordinator who booked music nights and gallery openings. She lived a few blocks away and had been last seen leaving a late shift at a bar. The man who would become the center of the investigation was named Caleb Price, 32, living alone in a small apartment a short bus ride north of the city. By the time cameras in the neighborhood had been reviewed and phone records pulled, his face filled the local news. The question everyone asked in different ways, friends, neighbors, co-workers, was the one that keeps people awake at night. Why did he follow her? Why did he kill her? They met on a dating app in late summer. On his profile, Caleb called himself a graphic designer who loved indie films and quiet walks. He liked obscure bands and posted photographs of window light catching dust. To people who knew him vaguely, he fit a certain sad but harmless profile. Earnest, awkward, the sort of man who could melt into the background at a party and then later critique the lighting on the photos. Leah's profile was different in tone, bright, immediate, full of small details about things she loved. A favorite taco truck, a dog she volunteered to walk, a laugh that seemed to show up in every picture. Their first messages were ordinary. A joke about a bad latte, a comment about a street mural. What made the interaction unusual was how quickly Caleb invested it with meaning. He saved screenshots, he tagged locations in memory, he archived voice notes. For him, the exchanges were not casual. They were a construction project, a foundation laid message by message, image by image. Leah, polite and warm, engaged for a few weeks. She answered his questions, asked some of her own, and at times responded with breezy enthusiasm. For a short time, she was a presence in his day that softened routine. Then, slowly, something shifted. Leah began to reply later. The gaps in communication stretched like hairline cracks. She spent entire afternoons without response, then evenings surfaced where she simply disappeared from his chat feed. When she did reply, her messages were punctuated and distracted. She wrote about being busy at work, about friends visiting from out of town, about needing to focus on a project. The casual warmth became intermittent. The first small photograph that struck him was innocent on its face. Leah laughing beside a man at a rooftop party. They were kissing softly at the edge of the frame. It was not a declaration, not a pose meant to wound, but to Caleb it landed like a verdict. He stared at the image as if trying to tilt it into clarity. In the blur of other photos, he saw his imagined future dissolve. He began to tell himself explanations, that the man was a cousin, a friend, until the comments confirmed otherwise. The picture, the hearts, and the short replies rewired his perception. He had been replaced, willingly excluded. From that moment, his behavior changed. Watching turned obsessive. He traced her posts with deliberate attention, noted patterns. The coffee shop she favored mid-morning, the gallery she visited on Thursdays, the jogging path she used early on weekends. He compiled a map of the fragments of her public life, each point a small fidelity to where she might be. He messaged more, asked who she was seeing, demanded explanations for silence. She gave simple answers and sometimes none at all. When she blocked him on one platform, he moved to another, and when she stopped answering altogether, his messages darkened into pleading and then into anger. The escalation was not dramatic at first. Gifts left near her workplace, an unexpectedly encountered coincidence at a neighborhood event, a friend of Leah's who later recalled a man who asked too many questions. To people around Leah, these were nuisances, unwanted attention that could be dismissed and laughed about. To Caleb, they were confirmations of attachment and ownership. He began to rationalize. He believed that proximity would resolve the omission. If he could be present in the same air as her, she would see him as he wanted to be seen. When proximity failed, he planned for control. On an autumn night when the city was tasting rain, Leah went out with friends to a small venue in the center city. She posted a picture during the set, dancing and smiling under low lights. The man in the rooftop photo appeared in a later image, standing close, his hand at her back. For Caleb, seeing that image was a rupture that turned into purpose. He tracked the venue, learned the post-gig plans from a friend's public post, and waited for a window. What followed was a short, terrible sequence that left far more questions than answers for anyone not inside his head. Outside the bar, where the pavement smelled of rain and exhaustion, witnesses later described a man watching the crowd, his shoulders set, his hands tucked away. In a narrow alley behind, two people argued. A voice recorded by a nearby delivery driver heard a fragment about "why" and "you never told me." The argument ended, according to phone pings and a single eyewitness who came forward, with a sudden, decisive action. Leah collapsed into someone's arms and then onto the ground. A call came into the emergency dispatch from a shaken passerby. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. The investigation that followed moved at a pace shaped by both old police work and new technical tools. Detectives started with the physical traces: a smear on a stairwell railing, a cab receipt, the bar's security footage. They obtained the venue's CCTV and stitched together a timeline. They subpoenaed chat logs from the dating app and obtained phone records that showed Caleb's proximity to the scene at the time of death. Image metadata gave timestamps on Leah's last public posts. The pieces, when placed next to one another, created an arc from flirtation to fixation to confrontation. Forensic teams ran analyses on the clothing and the small objects found at the scene. Digital forensics specialists cloned phones and attempted to recover deleted messages. The metadata revealed a telling detail. After Leah stopped responding, multiple accounts logged in from the same IP range in Caleb's neighborhood. Attempts to open her profiles from burner accounts, and several searches about where someone goes after a show and how to follow without being seen. These searches do not prove intent in themselves, but in context they marked a pattern of premeditation assembled from attention. When detectives brought Caleb in for questioning, he was pale and quiet. His apartment, they reported, felt like a shrine to an imagined relationship. Photographs, printed from social media, were pinned on a wall, connected with string to locations and times. Notes with times and routes lay scattered across a small table. There were screenshots of conversations where Leah had written about freedom and space, and under them Caleb had scrawled responses that read like pleas and commands. His explanations varied from hollow apologies to the bizarre claim that he had wanted only to talk and that the argument had got out of hand. The prosecution later leaned on these artifacts to sketch their case. An online relationship that solidified into increasingly intrusive behavior, the obsessive mapping of the victim's life, the moment of decision where proximity turned violent. The defense tried a different narrative. They called experts who spoke of social isolation, of a man whose social skills had atrophied and whose rejection triggered a dissociative state. They argued that the escalation was the product of an impaired mind under extreme stress, not of a plan. In court, the two stories sat across from one another. each plausible in the way that human motives often are: messy, layered, and resistant to simplification. Outside the forensic tables and the trial strategy, the city watched and argued. Discussions about dating apps, about the way algorithms conflate attention with affection, multiplied in opinion pieces and on late-night panels. Friends of Leah organized vigils, set up memorials near the steps where she had fallen, and called for better protections for users who experience harassment. Policies that had once been theoretical, better reporting tools on apps, clearer protocols for stalking complaints, found voices that demanded action. The first phase of the case closed as investigators prepared reports and prosecutors assembled charges. What remained, beyond the legal language, was the ordinary catastrophe of a life cut short and a string of choices that escalated into violence. The story's next movement would take the case from police reports and coroner pages into the courtroom, where public and private grief would meet law. By the time the case reached the King County Courthouse, the story had already become a kind of urban myth. The lonely man who couldn't let go. The woman whose kindness became fatal. Cameras gathered outside the building each morning. Reporters framed the narrative as if it were a cautionary tale about digital obsession, but inside, the court atmosphere was stripped of drama. It was fluorescent light, stacks of binders, and the quiet hum of translation headsets. Caleb Price entered wearing the plain gray uniform of pretrial detention. His hair had been cropped short. He moved like a man who was somewhere else, a presence detached from his own outline. Across the aisle sat Leah's parents, Elena and Roberto Morales, a small family from Tacoma who had driven to the city every day since the indictment. Elena carried a folded photograph of her daughter in her purse and, each morning, touched it before the judge entered the room. The prosecution began with the simple architecture of evidence: text messages, location data, and surveillance footage stitched into a grim narrative of pursuit. Assistant District Attorney Dana Brooks laid out the timeline without embellishment. The defendant did not lose control, she said evenly. He planned, he waited, he acted. This was not passion, this was punishment. She described the weeks of online tracking, the blocked accounts, the fake profiles, and the drive downtown that night. Her tone was clinical, almost cold, but it gave weight to the facts. The defense, led by Thomas Avery, didn't deny that Caleb killed Leah. Their argument leaned on the concept of extreme emotional disturbance. They painted him as a man broken long before the crime, a life defined by isolation, social anxiety, untreated depression, and the illusion of connection that modern apps could give. This was not a calculated murder, Avery insisted. It was the collapse of a man who mistook attention for affection. Brooks countered by projecting Caleb's own words on the screen. Messages that turned from adoration to anger, written weeks before the killing. "You think you can just forget me?" one said. "You don't get to replace me like that." Another, typed the day before Leah died, read simply, "We're going to talk face to face, and you'll listen this time." The courtroom's silence after that slide wasn't respectful. It was heavy. Leah's mother pressed her hands together and looked down. Her father stared straight ahead, unmoving. Testimony from the digital forensics team filled the next 2 days. They walked through cell tower logs that traced Caleb's movements from his apartment to the downtown bar. They demonstrated that his phone had been in airplane mode for 3 hours, a deliberate attempt to evade location tracking. Then they presented security footage from the street, a hooded figure crossing toward the alley, the faint glint of a metal watch on his wrist matching the one taken from Caleb at arrest. Forensic specialists from the Washington State Crime Lab confirmed what the jury already expected. His DNA was on Leah's coat, her blood on the sleeve of his jacket. No other suspect existed. Still, the defense tried to humanize him. They called a former co-worker who said Caleb wasn't the type for violence, that he was shy, quiet, and always alone during lunch breaks. They called a psychologist who testified that Caleb's self-image was fused with rejection sensitivity, meaning he experienced social loss as physical pain. When it was Caleb's turn to speak, his words came haltingly. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he said, voice thin. "I wanted her to understand how much she meant to me. I just wanted her to look at me again." He paused, eyes unfocused. When she looked scared, I thought, I don't even know what I thought anymore. Brooks rose slowly. "You wanted her to look at you," she said. "And when she did, you killed her." He didn't respond. The psychologist for the state later summarized his mindset in a phrase that would appear in countless editorials. He mistook absence for betrayal. The expert explained how loneliness can metastasize into resentment, how certain personalities turn rejection into a threat to identity. But beneath the analysis was a simple truth. Caleb could have walked away at any point, and he didn't. Halfway through the trial, the court played the last voicemail Leah had sent to a friend minutes before her death. Her voice was rushed but steady. "I think he's outside again," she whispered. "I'm fine. I just want to get home." The words hung in the room like a bell that refused to stop ringing. One juror covered her face. Another stared into the distance, unmoving. After that, the defense no longer argued for innocence, only for mercy. They asked the jury to consider his mental state, to see a damaged man rather than a monster. But Brooks ended her closing argument with a sentence that cut through the courtroom's fatigue. "Mercy is for those who stop before it's too late." He didn't. When the verdict came, no one seemed surprised. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge thanked the jury and ordered sentencing for the following week. Caleb showed no visible reaction. Leah's father nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if confirming something that had already been decided months earlier. In the days that followed, opinion pages filled with reflections about the case, articles titled "The Age of Digital Rejection" and "How Attention Turns to Violence." Talk shows debated whether dating apps fueled obsession or merely exposed it. Advocacy groups used Leah's name to push for stronger harassment protections and easier restraining orders. The final sentencing hearing arrived under gray skies. Caleb stood before the court for the last time. His lawyer read a brief statement of regret. It sounded rehearsed. When the judge asked if he wanted to speak, he hesitated. "I wish she'd never met me," he said finally. "I wish I didn't exist." The judge's voice was firm, but not cruel. "You took a life because you could not tolerate being ignored," she said. "For that, you will spend the rest of yours under the custody of the state." The sentence: life imprisonment without parole. After the hearing, Leah's parents stepped into the drizzle outside the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. Elena shook her head softly. "It's done," she said. "But it's never over." Inside the jail that evening, Caleb sat in the intake cell waiting for transfer. Through the small window above him, a square of gray daylight framed the edge of the sky. He whispered something no one could hear. A name, maybe, or just the word "sorry," repeated until it lost meaning. The world outside moved on, as it always does. But in Seattle, in that quiet stretch of downtown where the rain never seems to stop, people still leave flowers on the steps where Leah fell. They aren't just for her. They're for the fragility of all the small connections that begin with a message, and for how quickly they can turn into something irreversible. Months passed, but the echo of Leah Morales' death didn't fade. It lingered in the city's rhythm, In the hush of morning commuters passing the courthouse steps, in the bars where her friends used to meet, in the rain that always seemed to fall heavier near those glass towers downtown. Seattle had seen murders before, but this one had pierced something quieter. The illusion that digital affection was harmless, that loneliness didn't spill over into the streets. At Green Hill Correctional Facility, Caleb Price began the slow, colorless existence of a man reduced to routine. Every morning he woke before the lights, folded his blanket, and joined the line for breakfast. His cellmate said he rarely spoke except to ask for paper. He spent most days in the library, writing, not letters to anyone, but fragments of thoughts. Guards found pages filled with phrases like, "It wasn't supposed to end there," and "You can't apologize to silence." He attended mandatory therapy sessions, where a state psychologist tried to trace the pattern of his mind. "You saw her life as a part of your own," she told him one afternoon. "You erased the border." He didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the small window where sunlight touched the floor and said, "She was supposed to need me." The prison chaplain visited him sometimes. Their conversations drifted between faith and regret. "Do you believe she forgave you?" the chaplain asked once. Caleb thought for a long time. "I don't think forgiveness belongs to me," he said. "She's gone. That's the only truth." Back in Seattle, Leah's parents poured their grief into something tangible. They founded the Leah Project, a nonprofit that offered workshops on digital boundaries, teaching high school and college students how to identify warning signs of obsession, coercion, and stalking. Elena Morales spoke at universities and tech conferences, her voice steady even when her hands trembled. "My daughter wasn't naive," she said. "She was kind, and kindness shouldn't be fatal." The initiative gained national attention. Journalists framed it as a grassroots movement born from tragedy. Tech companies reached out, offering funding and promises to improve their reporting tools for harassment. New legislation, informally called Leah's Law, began circulating through state Congress, proposing harsher penalties for digital stalking and requiring dating platforms to flag repeat harassment reports across accounts. But for Elena and Roberto, activism was only a way to breathe. Some nights they drove to the spot downtown where Leah's memorial still stood. Candles, flowers, and a framed picture weathered by drizzle. They replaced the candles, sat in silence, and left before sunrise. They never spoke about forgiveness. They spoke about prevention. Detective Maria Chen, who had led the investigation, was promoted to lieutenant that winter. She kept one photograph from the case in her office, not of Leah, but of the string map recovered from Caleb's apartment. Red threads crossing a city, each knot a point of fixation. To her, it was a reminder that violence doesn't always begin with rage. Sometimes it begins with a tension that refuses to let go. In the spring following the sentencing, a journalist from the Seattle Tribune visited the prison to interview Caleb for a feature on modern loneliness. The warden approved a single hour. Caleb arrived in shackles, thinner than before, his eyes dull but alert. "Why did you do it?" the journalist asked gently. Caleb looked down at his hands. "Because I thought she was the only thing keeping me real," he said. "When she stopped talking, it felt like I stopped existing. You could have walked away." He smiled faintly. "That's what normal people do." The article ran under the headline, "When Love Becomes Proof of Existence." It was shared widely, dissected in classrooms and think pieces. Readers debated whether the story humanized a killer or warned against the quiet epidemic of isolation in the digital age. 2 years later, Leah's Law passed unanimously in Washington state. It required dating platforms to store behavioral flags for stalking, harassment, and identity manipulation, sharing data across services when users were banned for predatory behavior. It also funded therapy programs for people struggling with obsessive or controlling attachment patterns. The Morales family attended the signing ceremony but refused interviews. Elena simply told reporters, "I hope this helps someone else's daughter come home." The world moved on, as it always does, but the city kept its scars. The steps where Leah had fallen were eventually restored and polished, but every few weeks someone still placed flowers there. New people came, unaware of the story, and noticed the bouquet without context. Those who knew stayed silent. Some tragedies don't need retelling to remain alive. Inside prison, Caleb continued to write. He never applied for appeal, never sought clemency. His journal entries shifted over time, from denial to memory, from excuses to exhaustion. The last page the prison archivist ever received from him read, "She was sunlight, I was shadow. When I reached for her, I forgot that shadows only exist when they cover the light." Years later, a documentary about Leah's case aired on national television. It ended not with courtroom footage or crime scene photos, but with a montage of the foundation she inspired. Students in classrooms, victims receiving counseling, workshops teaching people how to recognize danger before it blooms. The final shot showed her mother, standing by the waterfront at dusk, the skyline flickering behind her. "She was loved," Elena said softly, "and that's the part no one can take from her." The screen faded to black, and in the quiet that followed, as viewers across the country sat in their living rooms, the story of Leah Morales became less about a murder and more about how fragile connection can be, how easily longing can rot into control, and how one woman's death forced an entire city to finally see it.